The Haunting of Willow Creek. Willow Creek was a quiet, forgotten town, tucked away deep in the woods of northern Maine. Growing up, I heard stories about it, but it wasn't until I returned from my grandmother's funeral that I really took notice of the place. In particular, there was one building that no one dared approach, Willow Creek Manor. The old manor sat on the edge of town, practically swallowed by the forest. The windows were shattered, the doors barely hanging on, and vines had wrapped themselves around the walls like they were pulling the place into the earth. Everyone had a story about it. Some heard strange noises, others swore they saw lights flicker through the windows at night. But no one had ever stayed long enough to know for sure. I had heard all those stories growing up. My grandmother used to tell me about the Danforth family, the original owners, who vanished on a stormy night nearly a century ago. Some said they fled the town, others whispered of something far worse. As a kid, I was terrified of the place. But standing there as an adult, staring at the crumbling remains of the manor, my fear had turned into something else, curiosity. I wasn't a child anymore. I didn't believe in ghosts. That's what I told myself as I stood before the rusted iron gate, debating whether to turn back. I don't know why I felt the need to go inside. Maybe it was because I had returned to Willow Creek for the first time in years, or maybe because my grandmother's stories were creeping back into my mind. Either way, I pushed the gate open with a loud groan, my breath fogging in the cool October air as I made my way to the manor. The door barely held on its hinges as I shoved it open, revealing a dusty foyer. The air was thick, and it smelled like damp wood and rot. A grand staircase loomed ahead of me, falling apart like the rest of the house. Dust swirled in the dim light, and every creak of the floorboards seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I stepped inside, my heart pounding harder than I liked to admit. The place felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. But I pushed forward, flashlight in hand, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. I passed room after room, each one more decayed than the last. Furniture was covered in thick layers of dust, cobwebs clung to every corner, and the air was heavy, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for years. I stopped in what must have been the parlor. An old mirror hung over the fireplace, cracked and grimy. I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, or maybe a figure, moving in the mirror. My pulse quickened, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I tried to brush it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. But then I heard it. Ellie. A whisper. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, had said my name. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stood frozen, listening. For a moment, all I could hear was my own shallow breathing. Then, the voice came again, clearer this time. Ellie, help us. I backed away from the mirror, flashlight trembling in my grip. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The air in the room seemed to shift, like the temperature had dropped. I swung the flashlight around, and that's when I saw her. A figure stood by the broken window, a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow, and her dress hung in tattered rags. She barely looked human, flickering in and out of sight like a candle in the wind. Her empty eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Before I could move, she disappeared, fading into the darkness like a mirage. But the heavy, oppressive feeling didn't leave. If anything, it got worse. The air felt thicker, and I could hear something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. Leave, or join us. This voice was different, low, guttural, filled with malice. Panic surged through me, and I bolted. I ran toward the door, my flashlight slipping from my hand as I fumbled for the handle. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang as I stumbled out into the yard. I didn't stop running until I was back at the gate, gasping for breath. I turned back, half expecting to see something chasing me, but the manor stood still and silent, the windows dark, as though nothing had happened. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. I didn't speak about that day to anyone. Even now, the memory of that house lingers, creeping into my thoughts when the wind howls through the trees at night. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear it, the whispers of Willow Creek Manor, calling my name, waiting for me to return. The Forgotten Tenants. It was late October when I first moved into the old apartment on Ashwood Street. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't have much of a choice. After being laid off and struggling to make ends meet, I needed something affordable, and the dingy, faded brick building at the end of a quiet street seemed perfect. The landlord, Mr. Hartman, had mentioned it was an old building with character, but his eyes had flickered nervously when I asked why no one else seemed to be living there. The apartment itself was nothing special, a one-bedroom unit with creaky hardwood floors, high ceilings, and large windows that overlooked the overgrown courtyard. The walls were painted a dull yellow, peeling in some places, and the air inside had a strange musty smell, like damp wood and dust that had been undisturbed for too long. Still, I was grateful for the space, and for the first few days, I busied myself with unpacking, ignoring the strange noises that seemed to echo through the halls at night. The first time I noticed something was wrong was during my third night there. I'd been trying to sleep, but a persistent tapping sound kept waking me. At first, I thought it was just the pipes rattling, an old building quirk. But as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I realized it wasn't the pipes at all. The sound was coming from above me. Someone, or something, was knocking on the ceiling. I got out of bed and went to investigate. Standing in the hallway outside my apartment, I looked up at the ceiling where the noise was coming from. It was faint but steady, like someone tapping their fingers in a slow, rhythmic pattern. I didn't know anyone lived in the unit above mine, but I figured maybe I had been wrong. Maybe someone had moved in without me noticing. That was the explanation I clung to, at least, as I went back to bed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The next morning, I ran into Mr. Hartman while leaving for work. I casually asked if anyone had moved into the unit above me, hoping for an explanation. He looked at me strangely. "There's no one above you," he said flatly. "That unit's been empty for years." I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck, but I forced a smile. "Are you sure?" "I thought I heard footsteps last night." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm sure. It's been vacant for a long time. No one goes in there." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and left, but the unease stuck with me throughout the day. That night, I lay awake in bed again, staring at the ceiling. I could still hear the faint tapping, and now I knew for certain that it wasn't another tenant. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal trapped in the walls or something to do with the old plumbing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was too precise, too deliberate. The next few nights, things escalated. I began hearing whispers, soft and unintelligible, just on the edge of my hearing, like someone was having a conversation in the next room. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the hallway when I was alone in the apartment. My keys would disappear, only to show up in strange places I hadn't left them. My lights flickered constantly, no matter how many times I replaced the bulbs. One evening, fed up with the constant disturbances, I decided to investigate the apartment above me. If no one lived there, then maybe something else was causing the strange sounds. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs. The door to the upstairs unit was locked, but to my surprise, it wasn't hard to break in. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing a room frozen in time. The furniture was still there, dusty, covered in sheets, but untouched. An old armchair sat by the window, and a wooden table was placed in the center of the room. On the table, an ancient rotary phone sat, disconnected, its cord hanging limply off the edge. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and mildew, as if no one had stepped foot in the room for decades. I swept my flashlight across the room, my heart racing. The shadows seemed to dance along the walls, making me feel like I wasn't alone. As I moved deeper into the apartment, I came across something odd. Framed photographs hung along one wall, their glass frames cracked and yellowed with age. They were black and white images of the building, taken decades ago. One photo in particular caught my attention. It was a picture of the building's tenants from the 1950s, all standing together in front of the entrance. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the man standing in the back, Mr. Hartman. He looked the same as he did now, unchanged, his expression blank and cold. A sharp knock suddenly echoed through the apartment. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was no one there. Then I heard it again, the tapping on the ceiling, this time directly above me. But I was on the top floor. There shouldn't have been anything above me. The sound was coming from the attic. Without thinking, I found the pull-down ladder to the attic and climbed up. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp rot filled my nose. As my head peeked into the attic, my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. I heard it then, breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, so close I could feel the chill of it on my skin. My heart pounded as I scrambled back down the ladder, but something caught my arm, yanking me back with cold, iron strength. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but there was nothing there. No one. The grip released, and I tumbled down, hitting the floor hard. I ran out of the apartment and didn't look back. I left everything behind, breaking my lease, abandoning the building, and never returning. But I still dream about that night, waking up to the sound of tapping above me, feeling the icy breath on my skin, and knowing that whatever haunts that building still remembers me. The Silent Watcher. I never believed in ghosts. Growing up, I always brushed off supernatural stories as figments of overactive imaginations. But all of that changed when I moved into the old Victorian house on Elmwood Avenue. The house had stood vacant for years, tucked away behind a line of tall, gnarled trees. When I first saw it, there was something about the way it stood, silent, almost brooding, that drew me in. The price was too good to pass up, especially for a house of its size. The previous owner, a reclusive woman named Mrs. Thorne, had died over a decade ago, leaving the house to gather dust. The real estate agent told me this with a nervous laugh, as if it was a minor inconvenience. But I didn't care. I needed a fresh start, and this house seemed perfect. So, I signed the papers and moved in. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was old, but charming. It had the usual creaks and groans of an ancient structure, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. I spent my days unpacking, settling into the large rooms and high ceilings. The only thing that gave me pause was a peculiar feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I was alone in the living room or the hallway, I would get the distinct impression that someone was standing just behind me, quietly observing. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the empty, dimly lit hallways and the quiet creaks of the house settling. One night, after a long day of unpacking, I sat in the living room with a glass of wine, flipping through an old book I had found in the attic. It was a history of the house, dating back to the 1800s. The book mentioned the house's previous occupants, many of whom had passed away under mysterious circumstances. Some died in accidents, others simply disappeared, and a few, like Mrs. Thorne, lived alone until their deaths. I closed the book and set it aside, feeling a chill run through me. The house suddenly felt much colder. I glanced at the window. Thick, heavy curtains covered it, but I could see the reflection of the room in the glass. That's when I noticed something strange. In the reflection, I saw the faint outline of a figure standing in the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat, and I whipped around, but there was no one there. The corner was empty, just a shadow cast by the tall grandfather clock. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just tired. But the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I'd be cooking in the kitchen or reading in the study and feel eyes on me. At night, the air in the house became unnervingly still, and the creaks that once seemed normal now echoed through the halls with an unnatural intensity. Worse, I began hearing soft footsteps coming from upstairs when I knew I was alone. One evening, while I was lying in bed, I heard it again, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something moving. My heart raced, and I sat up, staring at the closed door, waiting for it to stop. But the footsteps grew closer, until they stopped just outside the door. I held my breath. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the door handle began to turn, ever so slowly. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind raced, telling me there was no one else in the house, that I was imagining things. But then the door creaked open, just a sliver, and I saw it, a figure standing in the darkness of the hallway. It was tall, with a gaunt, shadowy frame, its eyes dark pits that seemed to lock onto me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silently watching. I scrambled out of bed, flicking on the light, and in an instant, the figure vanished. The hallway was empty, the door slightly ajar, but no sign of anyone or anything. Shaken, I spent the rest of the night with every light in the house on, sitting in the living room, clutching my phone, ready to call for help. But as the hours passed and nothing else happened, I started to doubt myself. Maybe it had all been a trick of the light, my imagination running wild in the darkness. That's what I wanted to believe. But the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dust on the floor outside my bedroom, were footprints. Large, heavy, and unmistakably human, leading from the hallway to my bedroom door. They stopped right where I had seen the figure standing. I knew then that whatever was in the house wasn't just a product of my mind. There was something, or someone, there with me. The next few nights were worse. Every time I tried to sleep, I would hear the footsteps again, pacing outside my door. Sometimes, the door would creak open, just a crack, and I would feel those eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up what little I could and left the house, never looking back. I didn't care about breaking my lease or losing my deposit. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there another night. The house was not empty. It never had been. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that house. But I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake, to leave the door unlocked, or the light off. And somewhere, in the dark halls of that house, I know it still waits. The Whispering House. It was the kind of house that no one wanted to buy, a 2-story Victorian, standing at the edge of town, half hidden by towering oak trees. The faded blue paint peeled off the siding, and the windows were smudged with years of dust and grime. I had passed it dozens of times on my way to work, always noticing how it seemed out of place. Every time I drove by, a shiver crawled up my spine, like the house was watching. I never thought I'd end up living there. I didn't believe in ghosts. Growing up, I always laughed off my grandmother's stories about haunted houses and restless spirits. But when the old house went up for sale, the price was too good to ignore. I had just gone through a tough breakup, and I needed a fresh start, a place of my own. So, despite the house's reputation and the rumors swirling around town, I bought it. The first few days after I moved in were uneventful. The house was cold, much colder than I expected for late summer. But other than the odd draft or creak of the floorboards, it felt normal. I spent my time unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. But on the third night, everything changed. It started with a whisper. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it, a soft, raspy voice, just inches from my ear. I sat up, heart pounding, but the room was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind. But as I lay back down, I heard it again, clearer this time. Get out. I froze. My mind raced through explanations, an old house settling, a draft coming through the walls. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The voice was too real, too deliberate. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as a dream. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, following me as I went about my day. By evening, I was on edge, jumping at every little noise. That night, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Get out. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and cold. I grabbed my phone, shining the light around the room, but nothing was there. Just the shadowy outlines of my furniture, sitting in eerie stillness. I didn't sleep at all that night. The whispers became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes, they were faint and distant, like someone speaking from another room. Other times, they were right beside me, in my ear, cold breath grazing my skin. I started avoiding the bedroom, sleeping on the couch in the living room instead. But the whispers followed me there, too. A week after moving in, I found something strange in the basement. I had been trying to avoid that part of the house. It was damp and musty, filled with the smell of rotting wood and something else, something metallic. But I needed to check the water heater, so I reluctantly went down the creaky stairs. The basement was worse than I had imagined. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the air felt thick with moisture. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room. That's when I saw it, a door hidden behind a stack of old, broken furniture. It was small, barely noticeable, with a rusty metal handle. I hesitated, but something, curiosity or maybe desperation, pushed me to open it. The door groaned on its hinges, revealing a small, dark room. In the center of the room sat an old wooden chair, covered in dust. But what caught my attention were the scratches on the walls. Hundreds of jagged marks, like someone had clawed at the plaster over and over again. I backed out of the room, heart racing. I slammed the door shut and ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I didn't want to know who or what had made those marks. All I knew was that I wasn't alone in the house. That night, the whispers were relentless. They didn't just tell me to leave anymore. They pleaded, they threatened, they cried. It sounded like more than one voice now, overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony of terror. In the early hours of the morning, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and fled the house, driving aimlessly through the empty streets until the sun began to rise. I sat in my car, parked on the side of the road, wondering if I had lost my mind. When I returned to the house later that morning, everything was silent. For the first time in days, the air felt normal. I cautiously went inside, half expecting the whispers to start again. But the house was still. Then, I saw it. Written in the dust on the living room wall, clear as day, were the words, "We warned you." I left that day and never went back. Now, whenever I pass the house, I keep my eyes straight ahead. But I know, deep down, that it's still there, waiting, watching, whispering. The room at the end of the hall. When I first saw the old house, tucked away at the end of a forgotten country road, I thought it was beautiful. Its weathered brick, tall windows, and sagging roof gave it a haunting charm, like a place frozen in time. The price was a steal, too, and since I'd recently taken a remote job, the isolation didn't bother me. In fact, the idea of being away from the world for a while was appealing. I wanted to write, to focus, and this house felt like the perfect escape. The real estate agent had been oddly vague when I asked about the previous owners, waving off my questions with forced cheer. "Oh, the last family moved out in a hurry," she'd said. "But it's been well maintained." Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I remember thinking there was something she wasn't telling me. After I moved in, things were fine, at first. The house was old, creaky, but nothing unusual. I loved the long hallways, the way the light filtered through the ancient, dusty windows, casting shadows that stretched across the hardwood floors. It was peaceful. The only part of the house I didn't care for was the room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The door was always closed, and I never felt like going in. The rest of the house had been easy to explore, full of the typical quirks you'd expect in a century-old building. But that room, something about it gave me pause. I could feel it pulling at me, a strange, unnerving sensation, like I was being watched whenever I passed by. I told myself it was just a storage room, filled with forgotten junk from the previous owners, and decided to leave it alone for the time being. But as the days went on, my unease grew. It started with noises. At night, when I was settling into bed, I'd hear faint scratching sounds, like something, or someone, was moving around in the walls. I'd lie awake, straining to hear. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe mice or birds nesting somewhere in the house. But then, the footsteps started. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing down the hallway just outside my bedroom. I'd get up to check, but there was never anyone there. The hall would be empty, dark, and cold, the only sound the creaking of the house settling. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night, as I lay in bed, listening to the faint creaking of the floorboards, I finally heard it, soft at first, but growing louder, clearer. A whisper. My heart froze as I listened. "Come see." The voice was faint, almost childlike, and it seemed to come from the room at the end of the hall. I sat up, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the wind, maybe the old pipes acting up. But the whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Come see." I hesitated, but something, curiosity or fear, I'm not sure, compelled me to get up. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my bed and slowly crept toward the door. My fingers brushed the cold metal knob, and for a moment, I stood frozen, wondering if I should turn back. But then I heard it again, the whisper. It was right on the other side of the door now, beckoning me. I twisted the knob and opened the door. The room was dark, musty, and colder than the rest of the house, as if no light or warmth had touched it in years. The smell hit me first, damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small, plain room with peeling wallpaper and a single, dusty window at the far end. In the center of the room was an old wooden rocking chair. It was rocking slowly, creaking back and forth. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching the chair move as if someone had just stood up from it. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a cold rush of air pass by me, almost like a breath. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly had the overwhelming urge to leave the room. I backed out, heart racing, and shut the door firmly behind me. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I convinced myself it was just the wind, that the chair must have moved because of a draft or the uneven floorboards. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that room. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. A few nights later, the whispering returned. This time, it was louder, more urgent, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple, faint, overlapping whispers that seemed to swirl around me in the darkness. "Help us, we're still here." My skin prickled as the voices grew louder, filling the room with their eerie pleas. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but they only got stronger. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my things the next morning, not caring that I hadn't even lived there for a month. As I was leaving, I took one last glance at the room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see inside. The rocking chair was still there, motionless now, but I could feel the weight of eyes watching me from the shadows. I backed away, my heart pounding, and shut the front door behind me. I never went back. I later found out that the previous owners had left the house in a hurry after their youngest daughter went missing. She had vanished from her room one night, with no trace left behind. They searched for months, but she was never found. After that, the family moved, unable to bear the house's oppressive silence. I try not to think about the whispers, but sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she's still in that room, waiting for someone to come see. The mirror in the attic. When my grandfather passed away, he left me his house. It was an old, crumbling Victorian that had stood at the edge of town for as long as I could remember. Despite its age and obvious disrepair, it was beautiful in its own way: tall spires, arched windows, and an ivy-covered facade. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a child, and the memories I had of the place were blurry at best. I remembered exploring the big rooms and climbing the stairs, but the attic, that part of the house I avoided even as a kid. Something about it always made me uneasy. Still, when I inherited the house, I thought of it as a fresh start. I had been struggling with work, relationships, everything. So I moved in, thinking that maybe this old house could offer me some peace. The first few weeks went by without much incident. I busied myself with cleaning and fixing up the place. The house was in rough shape, and there was more dust than I expected, thick layers of it coating everything. As I worked, I felt the house had been waiting for me, like it had been asleep, dormant, for years. But it wasn't long before the strangeness began. It started with small things. At night, I'd hear faint creaking from upstairs, even though I hadn't been up to the attic in years. It sounded like someone, or something, was walking around, shifting from one spot to another. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old houses settle, I told myself. Wooden beams shift. But the footsteps were so deliberate, slow and heavy, like someone pacing. One evening, after hearing the footsteps again, I decided to finally check out the attic. The stairs leading up to it were narrow and creaky, and a cold draft hit me as I ascended. At the top of the stairs was a door, covered in cobwebs. I pushed it open, coughing as a cloud of dust rose into the air. The attic was large and filled with forgotten furniture, covered in white sheets. There were trunks, boxes, and shelves crammed with things that hadn't been touched in decades. But what caught my attention was a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. Its frame was intricately carved, but tarnished with age, the glass dull and streaked with grime. I don't know why, but the mirror unsettled me. It was so out of place among the old furniture, standing there like it had been waiting for someone to find it. I approached it cautiously, feeling the cold air around me grow heavier. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The reflection wasn't right. It was subtle at first, but the room in the mirror looked slightly different from the room I was standing in. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, and there was a faint movement, like something shifting in the corner of my eye. I blinked, and the feeling vanished. Shaking my head, I wiped the dust from the glass with my sleeve, revealing more of the mirror's surface. That's when I saw it. Behind me, in the reflection, stood a figure. It was tall, its shape distorted by the dim light, but I could see the outline of long, tangled hair and thin, bony arms. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty attic, quiet and still. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. I backed away, my skin crawling, and left the attic in a hurry. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But that night, the footsteps returned, louder than ever. They echoed through the house, coming from the attic and moving slowly down the stairs. I locked myself in my bedroom, trying to ignore the heavy footsteps as they descended the stairs, stopping just outside my door. The air grew thick, colder than before, and I could hear faint breathing, as if something was standing on the other side of the door, waiting. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it had something to do with the figure I had seen, with the noises in the night. I returned to the attic, grabbing an old sheet to cover the mirror, but when I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The mirror had moved. It was no longer against the far wall but had been dragged into the center of the room. The sheet I had seen draped over it before was gone. I stood there, heart racing, and stared at the glass. My reflection stared back, pale and trembling, but this time I wasn't alone. Behind me, in the mirror, the figure was back. It was clearer now, its long hair hung in wet, matted strands, and its eyes were hollow, empty voids. It stood motionless, just watching me. I turned around slowly, expecting to see it, but again, the attic was empty. The reflection, however, remained. I backed toward the door, unable to tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figure in the glass took a step forward. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. It took another step, its skeletal hand reaching out toward me. I turned and ran, slamming the attic door behind me, but as I stumbled down the stairs, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps following me, closer and closer. I fled the house that day, leaving everything behind. I couldn't stay there another moment, knowing that whatever was in that mirror was no longer trapped in the attic. It was coming for me. I sold the house as quickly as I could, never setting foot inside again. I don't know what happened to the mirror or the thing inside it, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the faint sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow. Steady. Waiting. The haunting of Willow Creek Lodge. Nestled deep in the heart of the woods, Willow Creek Lodge had always been the kind of place that felt alive, almost too alive. The ancient trees surrounded it like sentinels, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows against the old stone walls. I had heard the legend surrounding the lodge, tales of ghostly figures wandering the halls, of flickering lights in the dead of night, and a lingering chill that never seemed to dissipate. When I inherited the lodge from my estranged uncle, I decided to visit, not entirely believing in the ghost stories, but curious about my family's history. The drive to the lodge was winding and treacherous, the road flanked by dense foliage. As I arrived, a thick mist rolled through the trees, giving the lodge an otherworldly feel. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the smell of aged wood and dust. The interior was adorned with antique furniture, faded photographs, and remnants of a time long gone. I felt an odd mixture of excitement and unease. The air was heavy with silence, punctuated only by the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. I decided to explore the lodge, moving from room to room. Most of the spaces were filled with forgotten memories, but one door at the end of a dimly lit hallway caught my eye. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I pushed the door open and stepped into what appeared to be an old study. Dust motes danced in a weak light filtering through the grimy window. On the desk sat an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. I opened it, and the musty smell of old paper filled the air. The entries detailed the life of my uncle, his struggles with mental health, and a deep obsession with the supernatural. One entry, dated years ago, sent a chill down my spine. The spirits are restless here. I can feel them watching me, their eyes piercing through the darkness. I must uncover the truth about this lodge before it consumes me. The atmosphere grew colder, and I could sense a presence behind me. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. Shaking off the feeling, I decided to leave the study and explore the rest of the lodge. As night fell, I lit a few candles to illuminate the dark corners of the rooms. I settled into the large living area, determined to make the best of my stay. But as I began to relax, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the hallway, a soft voice calling my name. Emily. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the whispering grew louder. I got up, my heart racing, and stepped into the hallway. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped suddenly. I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Emily. I followed the sound, drawn toward the source. It led me back to the study. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the darkness within. The journal lay open on the desk, pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. I stepped inside, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the journal. The handwriting began to change before my eyes. The ink morphed into frantic scrawls, becoming increasingly erratic. The last entry read, "They are here. I can't escape. They want me to join them. I must warn anyone who enters. Leave this place before it's too late." A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the desk. Suddenly, the whispers became screams, echoing off the walls. "Leave. Leave. You must leave." I turned and ran, heart pounding in my chest. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, shadows reaching for me. I could feel something following me, a presence that clawed at my mind, urging me to stay, to give in. I burst into the main room and slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my racing heart. Just as I thought I was safe, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. There, in the dim light, stood a figure. It was translucent, a woman dressed in tattered clothing, her hair hanging limply around her pale face. Her eyes were hollow, filled with sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Help me find peace." I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I didn't know what to do. The woman reached out a ghostly hand, and a surge of cold rushed through the room. "Please, you must help me." With a surge of fear, I bolted past her, racing for the door. I fumbled with the handle, throwing it open and escaping into the night. The mist enveloped me, chilling my bones, but I kept running. The voices echoed behind me, pleading, desperate. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the lodge. The windows flickered with lights, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the woman standing in one of them, her gaze locked on me, eyes filled with a mixture of longing and despair. I jumped into my car and sped away, heart pounding. The whispers faded into the night, but I knew they would always haunt me. I never returned to Willow Creek Lodge, leaving the spirits behind, trapped in their endless torment, forever searching for solace. Even now, sometimes, I still hear their whispers in the wind, calling my name. The Curse of Hollow Creek Manor. Nestled in the heart of a dense forest, Hollow Creek Manor loomed like a dark specter against the night sky. The once majestic estate, now a crumbling relic of its former glory, had been abandoned for decades, shrouded in mystery and whispers of a curse that had befallen its last inhabitants. I had heard the stories all my life, tales of ghosts roaming the halls, and the eerie lights that flickered in the windows when the moon was high. My friends dared me to explore the manor on Halloween night, and despite my reservations, I accepted the challenge, thinking I could prove the legends wrong. As I approached the manor, the air turned cold, and an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. The moon hung low, casting an ethereal glow over the gnarled trees that surrounded the property. I stepped through the rusted iron gate, its hinges creaking ominously as I pushed it open. The gravel path crunched under my feet, and the house loomed larger, more foreboding, as I drew closer. The front door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, the old wood groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. Moonlight streamed through broken windows, illuminating the grand foyer adorned with tattered wallpaper and faded portraits of stern-looking ancestors. The atmosphere felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was aware of my presence. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a staircase that spiraled upward into shadow. With a deep breath, I ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. At the top, a long corridor stretched out before me, lined with doors that led to rooms long forgotten. As I wandered through the upstairs rooms, I was struck by a sense of sadness. Broken furniture lay scattered, and dust-coated remnants of lives once lived filled the spaces. In one room, I discovered an old music box sitting atop a dilapidated dresser. Curiosity got the better of me, and I wound the key, wincing as it squeaked in protest. To my surprise, it played a soft, haunting melody, filling the room with an eerie calm. Suddenly, the air shifted, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to see a shadow flit past the doorway. Heart racing, I stepped closer to investigate. As I reached the threshold, a cold gust of wind swept through the corridor, extinguishing my flashlight. I fumbled for the switch but found only darkness enveloping me. Panic surged through me as I whispered, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice trembled, echoing back as if mocking me. Then I heard it, a soft sobbing sound, barely audible but unmistakable. The sound seemed to beckon me down the hall. Against my better judgment, I followed it, stepping cautiously through the darkness. The sobs grew louder as I approached a door at the end of the corridor. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, before finally grasping the cold doorknob and twisting it open. Inside was a small bedroom, illuminated only by moonlight streaming through a cracked window. In the corner stood a figure, hunched over and shrouded in shadows. The sobbing ceased abruptly, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the room. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure slowly turned to face me, and my blood ran cold. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and dark, hair hanging in disarray. She wore a tattered white dress, and her skin seemed to glow with an unnatural light, though it was the expression on her face that haunted me, pure sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant wind. "They won't let me leave. Leave? Who won't let you? I asked, my mind racing as fear coursed through me. She pointed toward the wall behind her, her hand trembling. I stepped forward cautiously, and as I approached, the temperature dropped sharply. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, closing in around me. I glanced at the wall and gasped. It was covered in strange markings, symbols that twisted and curled like vines. They pulsed with an eerie energy, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to touch them. As my fingers grazed the surface, a jolt of energy surged through me, and I was bombarded with images, flashes of a family, laughter, then screams, and finally, darkness. The woman's voice echoed in my mind. They took me. They want my soul. You must break the curse. Suddenly, the room trembled, and the shadows danced wildly, reaching for me with cold fingers. I stumbled back, feeling an invisible force pulling me toward the wall. The woman's face twisted in agony, and I could see her fading, the light around her dimming. No! I screamed, fighting against the pull. I won't leave you. With a surge of determination, I reached for the music box I had found earlier, now resting in my pocket. I clutched it tightly and began to hum the melody it had played, feeling its soothing power flow through me. The shadows recoiled, and the room grew brighter as I sang louder, pouring every ounce of my will into the song. The woman looked at me, her eyes filling with hope as the symbols on the wall began to glow. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of shadows. Free us. As I continued to sing, the air shimmered with energy, and the shadows shrieked in anger. The markings on the wall pulsed and cracked, releasing a blinding light that enveloped the room. The woman smiled, her form becoming clearer, radiating warmth and peace. In an instant, the room exploded with light, and I felt a rush of wind as the darkness was banished. The shadows shrieked one last time before evaporating into nothingness. I fell to my knees, breathless, the music box still clutched in my hands. When I opened my eyes, the woman was gone, but the room felt different, lighter. The curse had been lifted, and the oppressive weight of sorrow was replaced by a sense of calm. As I made my way back down the stairs, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. Hollow Creek Manor was no longer a haunted place, it was a sanctuary for the lost souls it had once trapped. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, and knew that I would carry the memory of the woman with me, her spirit finally at peace. I turned for one last look at the manor, its dark silhouette softening in the light. I knew I would never forget the horrors that had transpired there, but I also knew that I had made a difference. Hollow Creek Manor would stand as a testament to the power of compassion, a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope could shine through. The Whispering Shadows. In the quaint town of Eldridge Hollow, nestled between misty hills and thick forests, stood the old Harrow House, a decaying Victorian mansion that had long been the subject of local legend. The townsfolk whispered tales of its last inhabitants, the Harrow family, who had mysteriously vanished one stormy night decades ago. After their disappearance, strange occurrences plagued the house, lights flickered, whispers echoed through the halls, and shadows danced in the corners. No one dared to approach the house, believing it cursed. But I was drawn to it. As an aspiring journalist eager to make a name for myself, I couldn't resist the opportunity to explore the Harrow House and uncover its secrets. Armed with a flashlight, a notepad, and a camera, I set out on a foggy evening, determined to document whatever I found. As I stepped through the wrought iron gate, a chill ran down my spine. The overgrown garden was a tangle of weeds and brambles, and the house loomed ahead, its windows dark and hollow like empty eyes. I took a deep breath and made my way up the creaking porch steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The front door swung open with a reluctant creak, revealing a dimly lit foyer. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through grimy windows, and an eerie silence enveloped me. I switched on my flashlight, illuminating the intricate woodwork and peeling wallpaper that hinted at the house's former grandeur. I felt a mixture of excitement and dread, as if the house itself was watching me. I began my exploration, documenting my findings as I moved from room to room. Each space was a time capsule, filled with forgotten belongings, faded photographs, broken furniture, and layers of dust that seemed to tell a story of despair. In the dining room, an ornate table was set for a meal long past, the silverware tarnished and the plates cracked. As I made my way upstairs, I felt an unsettling presence. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, and the air grew colder. I reached the second floor and entered a room that seemed untouched by time, a child's bedroom. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a collection of toys lay scattered on the floor. A small rocking chair sat in the corner, swaying gently as if someone had just left it. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably close. "Help me." My heart raced as I turned in circles, searching for the source of the voice. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence answered, but the whisper lingered, weaving through the air like a fog. I stepped backward, the floor creaking beneath me, and the chair stopped rocking. I left the room, my mind racing. Was I losing my sanity? I pressed on, determined to find the truth. The whispers continued, growing louder as I made my way down the hallway. They seemed to beckon me, guiding me toward a door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, and the faintest glow emanated from within. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, revealing a small study. Dust covered the desk and shelves, but what caught my attention was a large mirror hanging on the wall. Its surface was murky, reflecting a distorted image of the room. I approached it, drawn by an inexplicable urge, and peered into the glass. The reflection revealed not just the study, but a flicker of movement behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing behind me in the reflection was a figure, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were hollow, filled with an unbearable sadness. She raised a hand, and the whispers intensified. "Help me, please." Fear gripped me, but I felt a strange compassion for her plight. "What do you need?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The woman's lips moved silently, and I could see her desperation. In that moment, I realized that the whispers were not just echoes of the past, they were a plea for help from a soul trapped in this house. I took a step back, heart racing, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and a gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. Panic surged through me as darkness enveloped me. I fumbled for my phone to use its light, and as the screen illuminated the room, I turned to the mirror again. The woman was closer now, her face twisted in anguish. "You must find it," she cried, her voice echoing around me. "The necklace, it's the key." I glanced around the room, desperately searching for something that could be the necklace. On the desk, I noticed a small box, its surface engraved with intricate designs. I opened it, revealing a beautiful locket, tarnished but still elegant. As I held it up, the room shook violently, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The mirror shattered, shards of glass exploding outward. I screamed and dropped the locket, but before it hit the ground, the woman lunged forward, her hand reaching for it. In an instant, the room brightened, and the shadows receded. I felt a rush of energy as the woman's spirit enveloped me in warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now clear and filled with gratitude. "You have freed me." With that, the locket vanished from my hand, and the woman smiled before dissolving into a shower of shimmering light. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive weight that had filled the room dissipated. I stood there, breathless, as the first rays of dawn peeked through the windows. The house no longer felt haunted, it felt alive, as if a long-burdened spirit had finally found peace. As I left the Harrow house, I looked back at the manor, its silhouette softened by the morning light. The whispers had faded, replaced by a profound silence that felt like a blessing. I had come seeking a story, but what I found was far more valuable, a chance to give a voice to the voiceless and help a lost soul find her way home. The Lurking Echoes. It was a dark autumn evening when I arrived in the small town of Black Hollow, a place steeped in legends and whispers of the supernatural. I had heard the stories about the old Holloway estate, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted by the tormented spirit of Clara Holloway, the last of the Holloway line. According to local lore, Clara had vanished without a trace, leaving the house to decay while the townsfolk dared not approach it after sundown. As a ghostwriter searching for inspiration for my next novel, I was drawn to the estate. Armed with only a flashlight, my notebook, and a sense of trepidation, I parked my car at the end of the winding dirt road and made my way to the looming structure. The estate towered over me, its once grand architecture now cloaked in vines and shadows. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared down as I approached. The creaking front door opened with a hesitant push, revealing a dark foyer enveloped in an oppressive silence. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam of my flashlight, and a chill crawled up my spine. I stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath my weight as I crossed the threshold. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I began to explore the ground floor, scribbling notes about the peeling wallpaper and the remnants of furniture buried beneath layers of dust. An old grandfather clock ticked away in the corner, its hands frozen at midnight. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, but each time I turned to look, nothing was there. As I moved deeper into the house, I stumbled upon the parlor, its fireplace cold and dark. In the center of the room sat an antique piano, covered in dust but still strikingly beautiful. Compelled by curiosity, I approached and brushed my fingers across the keys. The sound that followed was discordant, echoing in the stillness, yet hauntingly beautiful. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. Darkness enveloped me, and panic surged within my chest. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight app just as I heard it, a soft, melancholic melody emanating from the piano. It was as if someone else was playing, though I was utterly alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The music continued, rising and falling like a forgotten lullaby. I turned to leave the room, but as I did, the music abruptly stopped, replaced by a whisper that sent chills racing down my spine. "Help me!" My heart raced. The voice was faint, yet unmistakably sorrowful. I stood frozen, every instinct telling me to run, but something held me there. "Who are you?" I whispered, feeling an overwhelming compulsion to stay. "Help me," the voice grew more insistent, echoing around me. Driven by an inexplicable urge, I followed the sound, retracing my steps through the darkened hallways. The voice led me to the staircase that spiraled upward, each step creaking ominously under my weight. I hesitated at the top, the air thick with an unseen tension. I turned left, moving toward the master bedroom. The door stood ajar, and the whispering grew louder, urging me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating the remnants of a once luxurious room. The bed was still made, and a faint, floral scent lingered in the air. In the far corner, a figure stood, shrouded in darkness. I squinted, trying to make out the details. It was a woman, her silhouette thin and fragile, her long hair cascading over her shoulders like a veil. Her dress appeared to be from another time, tattered and faded, yet still elegant. "Clara?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" The figure turned slowly, and I was met with a pair of hollow eyes filled with an indescribable sorrow. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I cannot rest." "Rest? What do you need?" I stammered, stepping closer, feeling drawn to her. "The necklace," she whispered, pointing toward a darkened corner of the room. "It holds the key." I followed her gaze and spotted a small jewelry box nestled in the shadows. My heart raced as I approached, opening the box to reveal a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single, glimmering pendant. The moment I touched it, a surge of energy coursed through me, and Clara's form flickered. "I am bound to this place," she said, her voice now a mere echo. "You must return the necklace to the family crypt." The urgency in her voice ignited a sense of purpose within me. "I will help you," I vowed, clutching the necklace tightly. "Lead me there." As I turned to leave, the temperature in the room plummeted, and shadows danced along the walls. I stumbled back, feeling a rush of cold air swirl around me, a cacophony of whispers filling my ears. "Help her! Help her!" they cried out in unison. I fled the room, racing down the hallway and back to the staircase. The shadows chased me, and I could hear Clara's voice growing fainter. "Don't leave me." I reached the front door, flinging it open and dashing into the night. The cemetery lay just beyond the estate, shrouded in mist. With every step, the air grew heavier, and the whispers faded into a chilling silence. I found the family crypt, a stone structure covered in moss, and hesitated at the entrance. Clutching the necklace, I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and despair. A series of stone coffins lined the walls, each adorned with faded engravings. In the center stood an empty pedestal, and I placed the necklace gently upon it. As I stepped back, a gust of wind surged through the crypt, and I felt a powerful presence fill the space. Clara's form materialized before me, now radiant and free from despair. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now filled with peace. "You have freed me." With that, the shadows dissipated, and a warm light enveloped the crypt. I stood there in awe, knowing that I had helped a lost soul find her way home. As I emerged from the crypt, dawn broke over Black Hollow, the first light of day illuminating the landscape. The Holloway estate stood silent behind me, no longer a place of sorrow. I had come seeking a story, but what I found was far more profound, a chance to lift the burden of a restless spirit and witness the transformative power of compassion.